Okay. Sorry, guys, a little internet outage. I've been having problems with Spectrum internet in the mornings during this morning slot over the last week. So I've been talking to them about getting a better connection. I have a 5G connection, and it really shouldn't be having these issues. But you know, whether it was YouTube, Zoom, or anything else, I don't have the access to any internet when that outage happens. So I have to switch over to mobile data, even if I just wanted to browse websites or something. So it's just one of the unfortunate realities of being back on, virtual learning for a few semesters. But anyway, guys, we're just making the best of it, and we're doing as we must. I see that 11 of you have already returned back. Thanks, guys. So this is something that can occasionally happen. It's unfortunate, but it's very rare. If and when we ever have an internet connection outage like this, just know that I'm always going to reestablish the stream, and I do have backup options. Like, I can always go to mobile data in case this happens. Sometimes with the mobile data, the bandwidth is going to be a little lower, and it could cause the definition of the image to be a slight bit blurrier, but the same content will be delivered through. And if there's anything that you couldn't read or see on the screen, just let me know in the comments, and I'll make sure to type the information into the chat so that there will be a record of it there. Okay, guys, so if anybody here has any kind of online connection to other members of the class, try to let them know that the class is happening again, and they should just return back to this this site. The channel, whenever the stream kind of gets disconnected, I sometimes have to end that stream like I did here and then reestablish a new one. So if you just wait around on the channel, you'll see a new live stream pop up there, like I think you must have seen just now. So anyway, guys, it's good in a way to go through one of these things once so that everyone has a sense of the parameters of how we would deal with that case. And this is basically the way of doing it. So, okay, guys, are we good to go? Let me, maybe I'll quickly send a Canvas announcement to the class so that if any other members didn't return, then they will know that the class is happening again. So just 2 seconds while I send that off to everybody. Actually, I'm a little paranoid to do it because if I open too many windows, it's almost like maybe this mobile hotspot will exceed its bandwidth and kind of start to slow down too much. So we're just going to wing it. I'm going to continue from here. I see the numbers are getting up to the basic number of members of the class. We got about 20 here present. So, okay, guys, just wanted to give you all a few moments to find the stream again and get us reestablished. So I've got a about. Okay, thank you, Stephen, for that. That's very helpful, and it does seem to have helped. There's more people that are arriving. So yeah, not to worry there, Alex. The notes that I have for the upcoming 2 objections don't involve a ton of written information on the board. It's kind of almost like a storybook type of essay, so this will be easy to explain. I'm going to try and write big, and so it's easy and legible if I just have a few things like the author's name. So for example, this is now the paper by this guy named W.K. Clifford. And W.K. Clifford, let's see. I'm looking on my own cell phone to see how that kind of comes across and looks. It's not that great, so I'm going to type these notes in, okay, guys? So here's what it says. W.K. Clifford, and he lived from, just opening the dates of his life here, 1845 to 1879. This is a British philosopher, mathematician, and he was an impressive scholar. He was made a fellow of the British Royal Society at the young age of 29. And you can see from the dates of his life, he didn't even make it to 35, but he had an impactful and important life. In 1877, he wrote this paper that we're going to study, which is called The Ethics of Belief. Okay, 1877, The Ethics of Belief by W.K. Clifford. In this paper, he tries to evaluate the morality of how we form our beliefs. The word ethics, we'll learn a lot more about that next week, but that's the next major topic of the semester. Ethics is the theoretical study of morality and moral concepts, so things having to do with right and wrong, good and bad, moral and immoral. So the title of his paper, oh yeah, let me get to your question, Claire, 1 second, but let me just finish this point. The title of his paper then just is exploring the question, is there any moral right or wrong about how people form beliefs? And in fact, W.K. Clifford thinks there is. He's going to argue that if you form a belief but you don't have any attention to the evidence, or if your beliefs are not based on sufficient evidence, then he would argue this is actually immoral and wrong, and so that's not a good thing to do. This can then function as an objection to Pascal, who invites us to believe in God, but not based on evidence that proves he exists, but rather on the hoped-for benefits of being right in case he does. Now, Claire, you said, I asked this in the last stream when it cut out. Okay, good. I think I remembered that. It got a little patchy afterwards, but it says, is it always given that if you don't believe in God, you go to hell, or is that just within Christianity? So very good question, Claire. And I think you have your mind on an important point that is sometimes stated in reply to Pascal. Pascal's wager crucially depends on some estimation of risks and rewards. So the force of the wager is all based around a feeling that you could be at risk if you don't believe in God. And as you said, this risk is something like either going to hell or whatever, being denied of heaven. And is it necessarily the case that in all religious traditions, there's a belief in the existence of hell, or that God would punish non-believers with hell? I would say that this is something that is in theology, and some people have a more traditional doctrine that hell is the ultimate punishment for the non-believer, but other people think that God still has grace and that he can allow people some measure of reward or just put them in purgatory. So it's an assumption that bases his argument, but it's something that is fair to question and challenge based on your particular religion or your interpretation of Scripture. But look, even if there's no hell, right, Pascal would say that at a minimum, God wouldn't reward the non-believer, so wouldn't allow them the heavenly reward. So whether it's the denial of the infinite benefits of heaven or the imposition of the infinite punishments of hell, Pascal thinks that that's his analysis and assessment anyway of the results of non-belief in case God exists. If that's something that's not true, though, then the wager would fall apart. And keep that in mind, because when we get to the next author, Robert McKim, he makes a point that is much like that. He basically argues that it could be that God is not so interested in whether you believe or not, and he's not necessarily motivated to punish all the non-believers just on that basis alone, or reward all the believers merely on that basis alone. Like, can you imagine if a person had a very declared faith in God? Would that really be sufficient by itself to meet the rewards of heaven? Or on the other hand, what if a person led a very moral and upstanding life and did good for people but never had the belief in God? Would that really be sufficient in and of itself for the denial of the heavenly reward or the punishment of hell? So if those things are questionable, then that's another reason to dispute the wager, because the stakes would no longer matter as much. You'd not necessarily be assuming that God punishes all the non-believers. So that's very good food for thought. I'm glad that you brought up that question. So anyway, let's talk about this Clifford if you guys are ready. So W.K. Clifford, as you can see in the notes, that's the author's name. You see the dates of his life, the title of his paper, and I tried to give you a brief preview of the topic. So in his paper, it really revolves all around another one of these hypothetical scenarios. And so to present his argument, he asks us to think of this ship owner example, the ship owner scenario. Okay, now I'm not sure how easy that is to read. I'm looking on my own cell phone. It looks a little bit blurry, so I'm just going to write it here. Okay, so the ship owner scenario. Here's how it goes. We imagine there's a ship owner. Here he is. Maybe you can at least see the stick figure, okay? This guy's a ship owner. He owns a ship. Here it is. This is the ship. Now, the thing about his ship, though, is that it's in very, very bad condition. This is a ship that's almost completely broken and beat down. So maybe I can try to show that visually. Here's a crack in the hull, water leaking from it, another hole over here. The mast is kind of bent and crooked. So it's a highly unstable and unsafe ship. This is the owner of the ship, and he knows all that. He knows exactly how badly damaged the ship is. He knows full well that if it's allowed to sail out of the harbor where it's currently docked, that it would probably just sink to the bottom of the ocean. Okay, so he's fully apprised of all these facts. It's like a car owner, right? The car owner knows what kind of condition their car is in. And so he, of all people, is 100% clear that this is a dangerous and unsafe ship to ever board or to ever allow it to sail again because of how old and beat up it is. But here's the thing. The ship owner kind of wants to believe that it could just complete one more round trip. Maybe there is some kind of venture that if the ship makes it around this last trip, he'll stand to profit in some way. So he really hopes and wishes that, as bad as the ship may be, that it could somehow safely make this last journey. So what he does is, knowing all this evidence of how dangerous it is, he kind of pushes it to the side of his mind, and he just keeps focusing on his hope and his wishful thinking that the ship will ultimately make it back safely. So he decides to allow it to sail based on this belief that's just simply based on the hope and the wish for good luck. He's hoping for good fortune, and he allows his ship to sail. Now, keep in mind what I said earlier. Despite his hopes and wishes that it will come back safely, he is totally aware of the evidence that the ship is in danger and it's not safe. But he lets it sail anyway, hoping and wishing that it will come back so he can benefit from that. Now, let me advance the story to the next little chapter or whatever. So suppose that after the ship is allowed to sail, it actually sinks, okay? So it sinks predictably, and all the cargo and all the passengers on the boat are just lost in the sea. They've just died. That's terrible, right? It's not a good thing for a ship to sink and people and cargo to be lost. So then what about that? Let's ask this new question. Based on the scenario I gave you, shall we say that the ship owner bears moral responsibility for these deaths? Is it something that he should be, it's reasonable to blame him for this? Yes or no? What do you think? Just an easy question. Don't have to overthink it too much. But what would be your hot take there? What's your reaction? This guy let the ship sail, knowing all the dangers, hoping it would work out. But it then did sink and everyone died. So is he to blame? And you guys are saying yes, 100%, and that's good. I think that's the right answer. That's the one that Clifford thinks is obvious to common sense. But let's go even a stage further, and I'm going to ask you a follow-up question. Why is it that you say he's to blame? Why is it fair to place blame on him morally? We all have the same intuition that he's at fault and that he is to blame. But I just would love to see what you think why. Why is it okay to blame him for this? Sometimes bad things happen and no one's to blame. So why is he at fault? That's also, I think, something that's pretty clear. But you can let me know how you would put it. Okay, so Alex, because he knew the condition of the ship. That's right, same, Marin, because he knew how the ship was not seaworthy. Exactly. So it's not like it was a total surprise. Oh my God, I could never have imagined the ship would sink. All the evidence showed that it was safe and sound. No, to the contrary, the evidence was very clear and he was aware of it. So he cannot profess some kind of ignorance of the facts. He knew the ship was dangerous. He knew it full well, and he instead ignored this evidence and went with what he hoped would happen. Okay, so good. Now let me ask you if I change the case up a little bit. Because he does that. He says, let's imagine an alternate ending, to this little story. So imagine the same beginning to the story. Ship is dangerous, it's damaged, and the ship owner knows that. But he hopes and wishes that it'll make one more complete journey. And so imagine that the same beginning of the story goes down and he lets it sail. But now I'm changing the ending. Suppose that just by luck, good fortune or whatever, it actually does make it back safely to its destination and nobody got hurt. That's the way that it played out. Let me ask you this question. Would it still have been wrong? Was it still wrong in version 2, where it manages to come back home safe? Was it still wrong, though, for him to let it sail in the version of the scenario where it came back, actually? Well, let me know what you think. Still wrong or not? Stephen, you say yes. Okay, and I can agree with you on that. Now let's ask the question yet again. In the second version of the case, why is it still wrong? Sometimes people say no harm, no foul or whatever. Well, in this case, there was no harm. So why was it still a foul thing to do? Let me know. Because it's easy to say. Still wrong because of the risk. Very good, Alex. Yes. And Ryan, you say because he's still putting the people on board at risk. Exactly. So when you put people in a dangerous situation and you know clearly based on the evidence that it is dangerous for them, you can't just be morally excused if good luck plays out in your favor, right? You still were taking the same risky action that very well could have led to death and destruction, but just by chance did not. So simply because chance smiles upon the person and favors their outcome, that doesn't excuse their bad behavior because it was still taken irresponsibly in defiance of the actual evidence, right? Regardless of the outcome, it's still a risk. Moral luck, very, very high level question, Stephen. We will talk a little bit about moral luck. In a way, there shouldn't be moral luck. It shouldn't be like, hey, just I got lucky that I'm not a bad person because the ship didn't sink. Let me give you another example that's based around the same kind of logic here that may be relatable to you in the modern day. Because keep in mind, Clifford, he's writing this in 1877, so people didn't have cars and stuff yet. But today, everybody pretty much has a car. So what if someone was really drunk, right, at an event, some party, social gathering, whatever, and they're really drunk and they're way too drunk to drive, and everyone knows it, and even they know it. Like, imagine there was someone with a breathalyzer, like, hey, blow into this. Let's see how drunk you are. And they're blowing, 0.2, something just outrageous. They're slurring their speech, having a hard time walking. So they're way too drunk to drive safely. And that's something they know. But suppose that this is one person who just wants to believe that they can somehow make it home anyway. They're like, I'm going to take a chance. I know I'm not safe to drive, but I don't want to stay at this place or call it Uber. And so all the evidence shows that I could hurt somebody, but let's just see what happens. So if that person gets behind the wheel and then hits some person and kills them, are they at fault morally and legally? Well, of course, yes. You guys know that. No one would say, hey, he drove drunk and he hit somebody, but it's not really his fault. It's just bad luck. Obviously, then it was his fault. But now take another version of that same case. The guy's drunk. He knows he shouldn't drive, but just he gets lucky. He's driving home, and maybe there's no one on the roads. Maybe it was a short enough distance. I don't know. But suppose that just by chance he gets home safe, even though he was that drunk. Would that excuse his behavior? Like, well, he didn't hit anybody or hurt anybody, so I guess it wasn't wrong. No, it was still wrong because it was the same action that very well could have led to the harmful outcome in the other version of the case. Okay, so the takeaway point then from this discussion of the ship owner is this principle that now Clifford is prepared to tell us. And so I'm going to write it in the chat. He says this. He says, it is wrong always, everywhere, and for anyone to believe anything that is not based on sufficient evidence or reason. Okay, so there's the principle I put there in the chat. And yeah, he does say that. He says, to sum up, it is wrong always, everywhere, and for anyone to believe anything upon insufficient evidence. And that's what's wrong with the ship owner. To coin a phrase, or to borrow a phrase, he says the problem sort of is that the ship owner exhibits what he calls a credulous character. And let me give you that definition here in the chat as well. Credulous character, a person who will believe things that are not supported, that are not based on sufficient evidence. A credulous character, a person who will believe things that are not based on sufficient evidence. And that's one case that we see in this ship owner hypothetical. He's credulous. Credulous derives from the word credibility or credence, which means how much truth that you assess to have with a given sentence or proposition. So a credulous character is a person who gives more credibility to statements than they actually deserve based on the evidence. And oftentimes the person who's credulous, it's kind of a close cousin to the idea of being gullible, or just being a kind of person who always engages in wishful thinking despite the evidence that is there. And what the author is saying here is that's actually wrong for you to form beliefs in the way that the credulous character does. The way that this ship owner is doing things is the wrong way to do it. You're not supposed to believe things just because you hope they are true. You should only believe them based on the available evidence. And the ship owner, when he believes that this ship will return home safe, that's not based on the evidence. In fact, it's totally in defiance of the actual evidence, which indicates the total opposite, that in all likelihood it will sink. And so whether it does sink or not, we can't say that his belief here was okay. That's his point. He says the action of letting the boat sail was clearly wrong because it's the action that leads to the possibility of real damage and destruction. But even the belief that it would be safe, which leads to the action, was wrong in the first place. So he's saying anybody out there who's forming beliefs just because they want these things to be true, they hope that they're true, they shouldn't be doing that. The only real fair and good legitimate reason to believe anything is because there's a body of evidence that objectively indicates that it's likely to be true. Okay, so all manner of belief that's done in a credulous way, he's arguing it's wrong. And he says there's basically two kinds of major harms that come from having a credulous character. So let me write those here. Two harms of the credulous character. Okay, so self-harm and social harm. So you might be wondering, well, what's wrong with that? What if I want to believe things just because I hope they're true and there's no good evidence for them? Is that really bad? Is that really wrong? Clifford's like, yes, because it's harmful. And here are the two ways that it's harmful. First of all, self-harm. Why does it harm you as a person to have a credulous character? Well, he says it's because, think of why a person would want to believe something that's not based on good evidence. Why would anybody say, the evidence doesn't support this, but I just want to go ahead and believe it anyway? It's always because the position that they believe is something that they hope is true. So it's always the case that it's out of a desire for something to be true that the evidence just does not show. And if you're the kind of person who can't follow the evidence, even if you can't just observe reality for what it is and even accept uncomfortable facts, then you're a poor judge of what's true and false, and that's going to poorly prepare you to take whatever actions are necessary in life to promote your best self-interests. Imagine that a person was told, you know, you've got a pretty tough cancer diagnosis here. This is the doctor telling them, and based on our tests, you're going to have to take this aggressive form of treatment, blah, blah, blah. And the person is so scared by the possibility of actually having that aggressive form of cancer that they say, this can't be true. I need to seek a second opinion, or I need to try and find somebody to tell me what I want to hear, which is that I'm okay and there's no big problem. And I don't want to take that aggressive course of treatment because that could be very debilitating. So I'm going to try and look for a better answer to give me the feeling of psychological comfort that I want. But all the while, they're ignoring the proper course of treatment that could probably help them to get into a state of remission. Another case, suppose that there's a fire that's starting to overtake someone's house on a hillside, and the local authorities have said, in our professional judgment, we have to ask you to evacuate because it's not safe for you to remain there. The fire could overtake your home. And they think to themselves, well, an evacuation is an inconvenience, and it's also a scary possibility to think that the fires could actually touch my house. So I just want to try and pretend that that's not true, and I'm going to believe against hope that it will just somehow avoid my house, and I'm just going to stay here with a whatever, like garden hose, and hopefully fend for myself and hope for the best. If the person does that, they're putting themselves in a more dangerous situation than if they just followed the evidence. Maybe a person doesn't like the fact that coronavirus is so dangerous, and so they hear all these experts on television telling them what they should do to properly mitigate it against the risks, but that is an uncomfortable fact to face, and so they just hope against the evidence that this is not so serious or whatever. In all these different cases, you're the one that loses when you have this credulous character believing in things that are not well supported by evidence. So if you follow the evidence wherever it leads, sometimes it will lead you to a painful or an uncomfortable conclusion. But it's better for you to face that so that you can deal with it as it is than to simply bury your head in the sand like the ostrich and ignore these things. So that's the self-harm. And the social harm just kind of piggybacks on that. So what I said about self-harm, if you want to put something in your notes, is that it makes you a poor judge of what's true and false, and it makes it very hard for the person that's a credulous character to face uncomfortable truths, which sometimes is necessary and important in life. The second part, the social harm, that's easy to say. He says that's just because to the extent that other people watch you, how you do your business, others over whom you have some degree of influence will follow your example, and then that will spread this tendency further like a disease throughout the world, you know? So like, you may think, well, I don't have a huge sphere of influence, but even if you have some friends, siblings, coworkers, classmates, acquaintances, in some small sphere of influence, you do impress your example upon other people. If you have like a little sibling and they see, hey, my older brother or sister, they just believe whatever they hope is true and they just ignore the evidence and facts. So that must be good, that must be justified, therefore I'm going to do the same thing. After a while, this tendency spreads so widely that we live in a world where nobody cares about the evidence and facts, and then we're really all at a loss, and that's very dangerous. So the author says we should not seek to promote and make more widespread this tendency to have a credulous character. You basically have an example to show forth to others, and it could be a good or a bad example. And he's arguing that a credulous character is irresponsible intellectually, and that's not the right kind of example to extend to other people. People might say, well, isn't it just my business? And here's Clifford saying, no, it's not just your business. The way you form beliefs helps to shape the world around you, and it helps to shape the habits of others too. So you should do your part and form beliefs responsibly on the basis of the best evidence. And that's what he said here in the book. It says, no man's belief is in any case a private matter which only concerns himself. Our lives are guided by the general conception of the course of things that's been created by society. Our words, phrases, forms, and processes and modes of thought are common property, fashioned and perfected from age to age, an heirloom which each generation inherits as a deposit and a saving to the next one. So we'll create the world in which we're going to live, and the example of how we form beliefs based on what evidence is something that affects and influences other people too. And of course, the self-harm, he says, it has influence upon the actions of him who holds it. He who truly believes that which prompts him to an action has looked upon the action to lust after it and committed it in his heart. If a belief is not realized immediately in open deeds, it's stored up for the guidance of the future. What he's saying there is that you may say, well, okay, well, look at the ship owner. This guy probably should form beliefs responsibly concerning his ship because that's where there's life on the line, and so there are big stakes. But what's the problem if I just want to have wishful thinking type of beliefs that are credulous if no major risks or stakes are involved? Like if I just want to believe there's aliens in outer space just because I love science fiction and I don't have clear enough evidence for it, what's wrong with that? There's no one that's going to be hurt if I have this belief, even if it's not perfectly justified on evidence. Clifford doesn't want to concede this. He says, you may think that's innocent enough to just form beliefs irrationally where there's nothing large at risk or at stake. But he says even those beliefs will form habits in your mind, and in other cases, eventually, the same kind of mental habits expose themselves where more is at risk, where now you are ignoring the doctor's diagnosis or the professional authorities' evacuation orders or social distancing guidelines. So you may think I can confine this credulous behavior to some relatively insignificant beliefs, but he says it's going to influence your habits of thought, and therefore it cannot be confined to just the innocent and innocuous cases. Anyway, then, so in the end, how can this be seen as an objection to Pascal's wager? Well, Pascal argued that you should believe in God, but he says specifically, there's no way to prove it, and I can't prove it, but rather you should just believe it because if you're right, that would be in your benefit. So he's asking you to believe something because of the hoped-for benefit of being right, not the evidence itself. And that sounds like an invitation to do what the ship owner has done, kind of, to believe that the ship will safely return, even though the evidence does not show this, simply because if he's correct in this hope, then he'll be the beneficiary of that outcome. So it's not a good thing to do things unless there's evidence to show them. And if there's no evidence to show something, you should merely say, I have to wait until there's better evidence, not put the cart before the horse and prejudge things without the evidence to show. At the end of the paper, he says, some people might argue that I don't have time to, this would be too time consuming to actually weigh all the evidence on each question that I form my beliefs about. And so he has a kind of clever response to that thought. He says, if you don't have time, on page 54, he speaks in the voice of his critic. He says, but I am a busy man. I have no time for the long course of study, which would make me a competent judge of certain questions, or even able to understand those arguments. And he says, well, then you should have no time to believe. So if you don't have time to look at the evidence bearing on a certain topic or issue, then you shouldn't form a belief about it prior to having looked at the evidence, right? Like a juror shouldn't decide on guilt or innocence until they've looked at the evidence presented in court. And in everyday life, you shouldn't choose to believe something until you've actually looked at the evidence about it. And if you feel like you don't have the time, then you also don't have the time to have opinions on that topic either, And so he doesn't definitively say, I'm attacking Pascal's wager and this is going against that way of believing in God. But he kind of hints at it in this passage on 53. He says, if a man holding a belief which he was taught in childhood or persuaded of afterwards keeps down and pushes away any doubts that arise about it in his mind, purposely avoids the reading of books and the company of men that call in question or discuss it, and regards as impious those questions that cannot easily be asked without disturbing it, then the life of that man is one long sin against mankind. So he's kind of like turning the whole phrase of sin on its head. Like if you form beliefs in a credulous way with no evidence, then you're actually kind of committing a sin against your fellow man. Now, I don't know. In the end, I think this is just an attack on a form of belief that doesn't have any evidence based around it. If there was a way of making the case that God's existence can be proven or shown through some type of logical evidence, then I don't think this would apply to it. But in Pascal's wager anyway, there's no evidence offered. It's just risk versus reward. Don't you hope you're right if you believe that there's God. Okay, guys, I'll tell you about Pascal's wager. And, W.K. Clifford's belief, which is a possible objection to Pascal. There's one more author that can be utilized as an objection to the Pascal's wager from our textbook, and that's this guy whose name is Robert McKim. So I want to at least try and tell you a few things about his paper. Robert McKim in 2001 had this paper called The Hiddenness of God. Yeah, The Hiddenness of God, Robert McKim, 2001. This is an American philosopher who, let me just get it here. He taught at a University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. And this is from a book of his in 2001. So The Hiddenness of God, one issue about God's existence that makes some people skeptical, I guess, is that he's hidden in a certain sense, meaning that the five senses, sight, taste, touch, hearing, and smell, that's how we inform ourselves about what exists in the world. Like, you know right now that I exist because you don't have to guess. You can just look at me, you can hear my voice, we're interacting right now. With the existence of God, though, it's not so immediately, obviously apparent. Like, you can't just use your eyes, look to your right, and boom, there you see him, or you hear him, or whatever. People speak in metaphors, like, the wind that's blowing, I can sense the being of God, but not as